The helicopter blades cut through the humid air like knives through silk. Below, the jungle spread endlessly, a sea of green that seemed peaceful from 2,000 feet. Sergeant Michael Brennan pressed his forehead against the cold metal frame of the Huey's door, watching the landscape scroll beneath him like a living map. It was March 1968, and the monsoon season had just ended, leaving the earth saturated and the rivers swollen beyond their banks. Brennan was 31 years old, a career soldier from a small town in Ohio, where his father had worked the same steel mill for 40 years. He had joined the Army at 19, convinced that discipline and purpose would give his life meaning. Now, 12 years later, he found himself leading a platoon of young men into a war that defied every rule he had ever learned. The briefing that morning had been precise. Intelligence reported a Viet Cong supply depot hidden somewhere in the Ia Drang Valley, a network of tunnels and storage facilities that fed the enemy's operations across the Central Highlands. The mission was straightforward. Locate the depot, call in coordinates, and let the Air Force do the rest. In and out in 48 hours. Clean, surgical, professional. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had pointed to the map with the confidence of a man who had never set foot in that jungle. The red circles marking suspected enemy positions looked so small, so containable. The arrows indicating their approach route curved elegantly around terrain features that, on paper, seemed like minor obstacles. Everything made sense in that air-conditioned room, with its fluorescent lights and the distant hum of generators providing a soundtrack of civilization. But Brennan had been in Vietnam for 11 months. He had learned that maps lied. They showed elevation and rivers and roads, but they could not show the way the jungle breathed, the way it swallowed sound and light and hope. They could not show the enemy who moved through that green maze like water through roots, invisible and patient and utterly at home. The other men in the helicopter were young. Most were barely 20, their faces still soft with the remnants of adolescence, despite the hard eyes they had developed over months of combat. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez sat across from Brennan, his M16 cradled against his chest like a child holding a teddy bear. Rodriguez was from Los Angeles, a kid who had grown up surrounded by concrete and noise, and the jungle terrified him in ways he could never articulate. He had confessed to Brennan once, during a quiet moment at base camp, that he dreamed of the trees at night, dreamed of them reaching down with their branches to pull him into the earth. Specialist Thomas Webb sat beside Rodriguez, his long frame folded awkwardly in the cramped space. Webb was the platoon's radio operator, a lanky kid from Georgia, who spoke with a drawl so thick it sometimes took the other soldiers a moment to understand him. He had a gift for remaining calm under fire, his voice never wavering even when bullets snapped past his head. Brennan valued him for that steadiness, that ability to maintain connection with the outside world when everything around them descended into chaos. The helicopter began its descent, and the jungle rose to meet them. From above, it had looked uniform, a solid canopy of green. But as they dropped lower, Brennan could see the texture of it, the way different species of trees competed for sunlight, their crowns forming an intricate mosaic of shadows and light. Somewhere beneath that canopy, the enemy waited. Or perhaps they did not wait at all. Perhaps they were already moving, already aware of the helicopter's approach, already planning their response. The landing zone was a small clearing created months earlier by B-52 strikes, a wound in the forest that had begun to heal with new growth pushing up through the scorched earth. The helicopters touched down in a storm of dust and debris, and the soldiers poured out, their boots hitting the ground with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this dozens of times before. Within seconds, they had established a perimeter, their weapons pointed outward toward the tree line that surrounded them like the walls of a green cathedral. Brennan was the last to leave the helicopter. He paused for a moment at the door, taking in the scene before him. The air was thick with moisture, so humid it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. The smell of vegetation was overwhelming, a mixture of decay and growth that seemed to seep into his pores. Insects hummed in frequencies that vibrated through his skull. And beneath all of it, beneath the noise and the smell and the oppressive heat, there was a silence that felt watchful, aware. The helicopter lifted off behind him, the downdraft from its rotors bending the grass flat before it rose above the trees and disappeared. The sound of its engine faded slowly, replaced by the symphony of the jungle, the clicks and whistles and rustles that never stopped, day or night. Brennan checked his compass, oriented himself to the terrain, and gave the signal to move out. They had 48 hours to find the depot, 48 hours to complete their mission and return to base. The plan was perfect, every detail accounted for, every contingency addressed. But as Brennan led his men into the shadow of the trees, he felt something cold settle in his stomach, a premonition he could not name but could not ignore. The jungle closed around them like a living thing. Within minutes, the clearing was invisible behind them, swallowed by the undergrowth. The canopy above blocked most of the sunlight, casting everything in a perpetual twilight that made it difficult to judge time or distance. Vines hung from the trees like curtains, some thick as a man's arm, others thin and sharp as wire. The ground was soft and treacherous, covered with a layer of rotting leaves that hid roots and holes and the countless hazards that could turn an ankle or worse. Brennan moved at the front of the column, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead. Behind him, the platoon spread out in a loose formation, each man maintaining visual contact with the soldier in front while keeping enough distance to avoid presenting a clustered target. They moved in silence, communicating through hand signals when necessary, their boots finding the quietest paths through the undergrowth. The first hour passed without incident. They covered perhaps 2 kilometers, a distance that would have taken minutes on open ground, but required careful navigation through the dense vegetation. Brennan consulted his map frequently, comparing the terrain features he could observe with the contour lines printed on paper. The correlation was imperfect at best. The jungle transformed everything, turning ridges into walls of vegetation and streams into muddy obstacles that bore no resemblance to the thin blue lines on his map. It was Rodriguez who first noticed something wrong. He stopped suddenly, his hand raised in the signal for halt, his entire body rigid with tension. Brennan moved forward carefully, his weapon ready, his senses straining to identify whatever had alarmed the young soldier. Rodriguez pointed at the ground. There, barely visible among the fallen leaves, was a footprint. It was small, much smaller than an American boot print, and it was fresh. The edges were still sharp, not yet softened by the moisture in the air. Someone had passed this way recently, perhaps within the last few hours. Brennan knelt beside the print, studying it with the attention of a man reading a message in a language he only partially understood. The Viet Cong wore sandals made from tire rubber, leaving distinctive tracks that American soldiers learned to recognize. This print was different. It showed the outline of a bare foot, the toes spread wide for balance, the heel pressed deep into the soft earth. Whoever had made this track was not just passing through. They were moving with purpose, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. He looked up at the jungle surrounding them, at the infinite variations of green that could hide 1,000 enemies. The plan had seemed so perfect that morning, so logical and precise. But plans were made in rooms with maps and charts, by men who measured distance in kilometers and time in hours. The jungle measured nothing. It simply existed, indifferent to human intentions, patient and eternal, and utterly unforgiving. Brennan stood and gave the signal to continue. They had a mission to complete, a depot to find, coordinates to call in. The plan would work because it had to work, because the alternative was unthinkable. But as he moved forward into the green darkness, he could not shake the feeling that they were no longer the hunters. They had become the hunted. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every satisfying episode reveals untold stories of courage and survival that mainstream history forgot. Subscribe now, because these stories deserve to be remembered, and you deserve to hear them. By nightfall, they had covered less than 4 kilometers. The terrain had grown increasingly difficult as they moved deeper into the valley, the ground rising and falling in irregular waves that exhausted the men and slowed their progress to a crawl. Brennan called a halt in a small depression between 2 ridges, a position that offered some protection from observation while allowing them to monitor the approaches from multiple directions. The soldiers established their night positions with the mechanical efficiency of exhaustion. They dug shallow foxholes, set up fields of fire, and designated listening posts at the perimeter. No fires were permitted, no lights of any kind. They would eat cold rations in darkness and sleep in shifts, 2 hours at a time, their weapons always within reach. Brennan made his rounds, checking each position, exchanging quiet words with his men. Their faces were barely visible in the darkness, pale shapes against the deeper black of the jungle. He could see the fatigue in their eyes, the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands never strayed far from their weapons. These were good soldiers, trained and experienced, but the jungle was wearing them down in ways that no training could prepare them for. Private Rodriguez was at the eastern listening post, his back against a tree, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the perimeter. Brennan crouched beside him, speaking in a whisper that was barely louder than breath. The young soldier's response was slow, as if he had to pull himself back from some distant place before he could form words. He had not heard or seen anything unusual, he said. Just the jungle. Just the sounds that never stopped, the rustling and clicking and calling that made it impossible to distinguish between the normal and the dangerous. Brennan understood. The jungle's soundtrack was a form of torture all its own. Every sound could be an enemy approaching, or it could be nothing at all. The mind strained to interpret each noise, to categorize it as threat or background, and that constant vigilance drained mental resources faster than any physical exertion. By morning, a soldier could be exhausted without having done anything but listen. He moved on to the next position, where Specialist Webb had set up the radio equipment in a small hollow protected by a fallen log. Webb reported that communications were functioning normally, though the dense canopy degraded the signal significantly. They could reach base, but the transmissions were scratchy, interrupted by bursts of static that sometimes swallowed entire words. Brennan had Webb send a brief situation report, confirming their position and their intention to continue toward the objective at first light. The response from base was routine, an acknowledgement followed by a weather update that predicted more humidity and possible afternoon thunderstorms. As if they needed a forecast to tell them it would be hot and wet. In the jungle, it was always hot and wet. He found a spot near the center of their position and settled in for his own rest period. Sleep was difficult in the jungle, the ground too hard, the air too thick, the sounds too persistent. But exhaustion eventually overcame discomfort, and Brennan drifted into a shallow doze that was more like a series of disconnected moments than actual rest. He dreamed of home, of his wife Susan standing on the porch of their small house, her hand raised in greeting or farewell, he could never tell which. The dream shifted, and he was in the jungle again, but the trees were different, taller and darker, and there was something moving through them that he could hear but not see. He tried to raise his weapon, but his arms would not respond, and the thing in the trees came closer, its footsteps silent on the forest floor. He woke to a hand on his shoulder and Webb's face hovering above him in the darkness. Something was wrong. Brennan could see it in the tightness around the radio man's eyes, in the way his jaw was clenched against words that did not want to come. Webb led him to the western edge of their perimeter, where 2 soldiers were crouched behind a fallen log, their weapons pointed into the blackness beyond. One of them, a corporal named Peters, gestured toward the jungle without speaking. Brennan listened. At first, he heard nothing unusual, just the normal chorus of insects and night birds that provided the jungle's constant background music. But then he caught it, a rhythm beneath the random sounds, a pattern that did not belong. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once he recognized it. Someone was tapping, a series of clicks and pauses that repeated at regular intervals. The sound was coming from multiple directions, from the north and the south and the east, surrounding their position in a web of communication that they could hear but not understand. The enemy was out there, in the darkness beyond their perimeter, and they were talking to each other. Brennan's mind raced through the possibilities. They could stay put and wait for dawn, hoping the enemy would not attack during the night. They could attempt to move, abandoning their position for the uncertainty of movement in darkness. They could call for extraction, but helicopters could not fly in this terrain at night, and artillery support was too far away to be effective. He chose to wait. Moving in darkness through unfamiliar jungle was almost certainly fatal, and the enemy might be testing them, trying to provoke a reaction that would reveal their strength and dispositions. Better to remain still, to let the night pass, and to reassess at first light. The hours until dawn were the longest of Brennan's life. The tapping continued intermittently, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, never quite stopping. The soldiers at the perimeter strained their eyes against the darkness, seeing movement in every shadow, threats in every rustle of leaves. No one slept. No one spoke above a whisper. They simply waited, their fingers on their triggers, their hearts pounding against their ribs. Dawn came slowly, a gradual lightening of the sky that filtered through the canopy in shades of gray. The tapping stopped as the darkness faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the jungle waking to a new day. Birds called from the treetops, insects resumed their buzzing, and somewhere in the distance, a monkey screamed. Brennan ordered a careful reconnaissance of their immediate surroundings. The soldiers moved out in pairs, weapons ready, eyes scanning the undergrowth for any sign of the enemy. They found nothing. No tracks, no equipment, no evidence that anyone had been nearby during the night. It was as if the tapping had come from the jungle itself, a warning from the forest that they were not welcome. The men returned to the perimeter, their expressions a mixture of relief and confusion. They had expected to find bodies, or at least signs of the enemy's presence. The absence of evidence was somehow more unsettling than confirmation would have been. It meant that whoever had been out there was skilled enough to move through the jungle without leaving traces, patient enough to observe without attacking, confident enough to let them know they were being watched. Brennan consulted his map again, tracing their route with a finger that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to control it. The suspected depot was still several kilometers away, through terrain that grew more difficult with each step. They were behind schedule, their progress slowed by the jungle and the need for caution, and the enemy knew exactly where they were. The plan had called for them to reach the objective by now, to be calling in coordinates and preparing for extraction. Instead, they were huddled in a depression in the jungle, surrounded by an enemy they could not see, facing a choice that had no good options. Continue forward and risk walking into an ambush, or turn back and abandon the mission they had been sent to complete. He gathered his squad leaders and laid out the situation in simple terms. The enemy knew they were here. The element of surprise was gone, if it had ever existed at all. But the mission remained, and the men who had planned it were counting on them to succeed. There was no extraction coming, no reinforcements that could reach them in time to matter. They would continue forward, moving more carefully, watching for signs of ambush, and hoping that their training and their weapons would be enough to see them through. The squad leaders nodded, their faces grim but determined. They were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders, even when those orders led them deeper into danger. They returned to their men and began the process of preparing to move, checking weapons and equipment, distributing the remaining rations, making sure every soldier understood what was expected of them. Brennan watched them work, feeling the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. These men trusted him to lead them safely through this mission, to bring them home to their families and their futures. But the jungle cared nothing for trust or leadership or plans drawn on maps in air-conditioned rooms. The jungle simply waited, patient and eternal, for them to make a mistake. They moved out as the sun climbed higher, its light barely penetrating the canopy above. The day promised to be hot and humid, like every day in this green hell, and the men were already sweating before they had covered 100 meters. Brennan led them forward, into the unknown, carrying with him the knowledge that somewhere in the shadows, the enemy was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The jungle grew denser as they moved westward, the vegetation closing around them like the walls of a labyrinth. Progress slowed to a crawl, each meter requiring careful navigation through tangles of vines and fallen trees that blocked every path. The men moved in silence, saving their breath for the physical effort of forward movement, their machetes rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to echo through the forest. By midday, they had covered barely 2 kilometers. The heat was suffocating, the air so thick with moisture that breathing felt like drinking. The soldiers' uniforms were soaked through with sweat, clinging to their bodies like second skins, and their faces were masks of exhaustion. Even the youngest among them, the ones who had arrived in Vietnam with energy to spare, moved with the heavy steps of men twice their age. Brennan called a halt near a small stream, one of the countless waterways that threaded through the valley like veins through living flesh. The soldiers collapsed on the banks, drinking deeply from their canteens while Webb refilled them from the stream, adding purification tablets that would make the water safe but could not improve its taste. The jungle water always tasted of earth and decay, of the countless organisms that lived and died in its brown depths. It was during this rest that Brennan noticed the first of the markers. It was subtle, easy to miss if you were not looking for it, a small arrangement of sticks and leaves that seemed too precise to be natural. He studied it for a long moment, trying to understand its meaning, before calling over Corporal Nguyen, the platoon's interpreter and the only man among them who had been born in this country. Nguyen examined the marker with the careful attention of a man reading a familiar language after years away. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern to something that looked like fear. The marker, he explained, was a warning. It indicated that the area ahead was controlled by the enemy, that any who entered did so at their own risk. The specific arrangement of the elements suggested that traps had been set, though the marker did not reveal their nature or location. Brennan absorbed this information in silence. The markers meant they were on the right track, that the depot they sought was somewhere ahead. But they also meant that the enemy had prepared for their arrival, had anticipated this approach and taken steps to defend it. The perfect plan, conceived in an air-conditioned room thousands of miles away, had failed to account for an enemy who knew the terrain better than the soldiers who had drawn the maps. He gathered his squad leaders again, sharing what Nguyen had told him, and discussing their options. They could bypass the marked area, adding hours or even days to their journey through terrain that might be equally dangerous. They could proceed with extreme caution, probing for traps and moving slowly enough to detect them before they triggered. Or they could call off the mission entirely, admitting that the intelligence had been flawed and that continuing forward would cost lives without achieving their objective. The debate was brief but intense. Some of the men wanted to turn back, arguing that the mission had been compromised from the start and that pressing forward was suicide. Others insisted on continuing, pointing out that they had come too far to abandon their objective now, that the depot represented a significant target that could save American lives if it was destroyed. In the end, Brennan made the decision himself, as he knew he would have to. They would continue, but they would move differently. Instead of a single column, they would spread out into a wider formation, reducing the risk that a single trap could catch multiple soldiers. They would probe the ground ahead with bayonets before stepping, checking for the pressure plates and tripwires that the enemy favored. They would sacrifice speed for safety, accepting that the mission would take longer, but hoping that more of them would survive to complete it. The afternoon passed in a haze of tension and exhaustion. Every step required calculation. Every meter gained represented a small victory against the invisible dangers that surrounded them. The soldiers moved like men walking through a minefield, because that was exactly what they were doing. Their eyes scanned the ground for disturbances in the natural pattern of leaves and soil, for the glint of wire or the outline of a pit concealed beneath vegetation. They found the first trap an hour after resuming their march. Private Rodriguez, moving carefully along the left flank, spotted a slight depression in the ground that did not match the surrounding terrain. He froze, raised his hand, and waited while the others gathered around to examine his discovery. The trap was a punji pit, a hole perhaps 3 feet deep, lined with sharpened bamboo stakes that had been smeared with something dark and foul-smelling. The stakes pointed upward at angles designed to pierce the foot and leg of anyone who fell in, their tips sharp enough to penetrate a jungle boot. The covering of branches and leaves that concealed the pit was masterfully constructed, almost invisible to an untrained eye. Brennan stared at the trap for a long moment, imagining what would have happened if Rodriguez had not spotted it. The stakes would have pierced through boot and flesh, embedding themselves in muscle and bone. The contamination on them, probably human feces, would have introduced infection that could kill as surely as the wounds themselves. A single trap, simple in construction, could take a soldier out of action as effectively as a bullet. They marked the pit and continued, their caution heightened by the discovery. Over the next 2 hours, they found 4 more traps of various designs. Some were punji pits, others were spring-loaded devices that would fire sharpened bamboo projectiles at anyone who triggered them. One, The most sophisticated they encountered was a deadfall mechanism designed to drop a heavy log onto anyone who walked beneath it. Each discovery added to their understanding of the enemy they faced. These were not crude, improvised weapons. They were carefully engineered systems designed with an intimate knowledge of human anatomy and behavior. The enemy understood how soldiers moved through the jungle, where they would step, where they would look, where they would fail to look. They had turned their knowledge of the terrain into a weapon more effective than any firearm. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Brennan realized they were not going to reach the objective before nightfall. They were still several kilometers away, moving far too slowly to cover the remaining distance before darkness made progress impossible. He called another halt in a small clearing, one of the rare gaps in the canopy where a fallen giant had taken down its neighbors and allowed sunlight to reach the forest floor. The men set up their defensive positions with the practiced efficiency of long experience, but their movements were slow, weighed down by exhaustion and the grinding stress of the day. They had covered perhaps 3 kilometers since morning, less than a third of what the plan had called for, and they had encountered dangers that no plan could have anticipated. Webb established contact with base, his voice calm despite the fatigue that showed in his face. Brennan took the handset and delivered his situation report, describing their position, their progress, and the obstacles they had encountered. The response from base was a long silence, followed by a request for clarification. The mission parameters had not included provisions for this level of enemy resistance. Command was conferring on how to proceed. The conference took 20 minutes during which Brennan and his men waited in the jungle, surrounded by an enemy they could not see, knowing that every moment of daylight lost made their situation more precarious. When the response finally came, it was what Brennan had expected and dreaded. The mission was still a go. The depot represented a high-value target that intelligence believed was critical to enemy operations in the region. Command was aware of the difficulties they faced, but was confident in their ability to overcome them. Additional air support would be available if needed, and extraction helicopters would be standing by for their signal. Brennan acknowledged the orders and handed the handset back to Webb. Additional air support. Extraction helicopters standing by. The words sounded reassuring in the abstract, but they meant nothing in the jungle, where helicopters could not land and airstrikes could not distinguish between friend and foe beneath the canopy. They were on their own, as they had been from the moment they stepped off those helicopters, and they would remain on their own until the mission was complete, or they were dead. If you have ever felt your heart stop while watching a story unfold, feeling like you were right there in the moment, then leave a comment right now saying, "I felt like I was there." Because this story is not over, and what happens next will shake you to your core. The second night was worse than the first. The tapping resumed as darkness fell, closer now, more insistent, surrounding their position in a web of sound that seemed to tighten with each passing hour. The soldiers at the perimeter reported movement in the shadows, shapes that flickered at the edge of vision and vanished when they tried to focus on them. Real or imagined, the movement kept everyone on edge, fingers hovering over triggers, eyes straining against the darkness. Brennan did not sleep at all. He moved from position to position, checking on his men, offering what reassurance he could, knowing that his presence was the only comfort he could provide. The soldiers looked at him with eyes that held equal measures of fear and trust, waiting for him to tell them what to do, how to survive this night that seemed to stretch toward infinity. Around midnight, the rain began. It started as a whisper, a gentle pattering on the leaves far above, and built quickly into a torrent that crashed through the canopy like a waterfall. Within minutes, the soldiers were soaked to the skin, their positions flooding with water that turned the forest floor into a shallow lake. They huddled in their foxholes, their ponchos providing minimal protection, their weapons cradled against their bodies to keep them dry. The rain brought one blessing. It drowned out the tapping. For the first time since nightfall, the jungle was silent except for the roar of water, and the soldiers could rest without straining to hear threats in every sound. Some of them slept despite the discomfort, their bodies surrendering to exhaustion that no amount of fear could overcome. Brennan remained awake, his back against a tree trunk, his eyes fixed on the darkness that the rain had turned even blacker. He thought about the men who depended on him, about the mission they had been sent to complete, about the enemy who waited somewhere in that darkness with patience that seemed inexhaustible. He thought about his wife, about the letters she wrote him every week, about the future they had planned together when this war was finally over. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that felt almost holy. The tapping did not resume. Instead, there was only the dripping of water from countless leaves, a gentle percussion that seemed to mark the passage of time in the absence of any other reference. Dawn came gray and misty, the air thick with moisture that rose from the saturated ground. The soldiers emerged from their positions looking like drowned creatures, their uniforms plastered to their bodies, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. But they were alive, all of them, and that counted as a victory of sorts. Brennan gathered them together and spoke quietly about the day ahead. They were close now, perhaps 2 kilometers from the suspected depot location. The terrain would be difficult, but they had learned from yesterday's experience. They knew what to look for, how to move, how to survive the traps that the jungle held. He did not mention what he suspected they all knew, that the enemy was letting them approach. The tapping, the movement in the shadows, the traps that warned rather than killed, all of it suggested a strategy that went beyond simple defense. The enemy wanted them to reach the depot. They wanted them to commit themselves to a position from which there would be no easy retreat. They moved out as the mist began to lift, spreading into the wide formation they had adopted the previous day. The ground was treacherous now, slick with rain and covered with debris washed down from higher elevations. Every step required careful placement, and progress was even slower than it had been before. The morning passed without incident, which somehow made the tension worse. They found no traps, encountered no resistance, saw no sign of the enemy who they knew was all around them. It was as if the jungle had decided to let them pass, to save whatever it was planning for the moment when they reached their objective. By noon, they could see the ridgeline that marked the edge of the valley where intelligence believed the depot was located. The terrain rose steeply ahead of them, a wall of vegetation that would require hours to climb. Beyond that ridgeline, somewhere in the network of ravines and caves that honeycombed the hillside, lay the target they had come so far to find. Brennan called a halt at the base of the ridge, using the pause to study the terrain and plan their approach. The slope offered no easy path, no natural routes that would make the climb less difficult. They would have to force their way up through vegetation that grew thicker as the elevation increased, fighting for every meter of vertical progress. He was still studying the ridge when Nguyen appeared at his elbow, his face troubled. The interpreter had been scouting ahead with one of the squad leaders, and what he had found had clearly disturbed him. He led Brennan to a spot perhaps 50 meters up the slope, where a small stream trickled down between moss-covered rocks. There, half hidden in the vegetation beside the stream, was a body. It was American, or had been, a soldier in jungle fatigues that were now torn and stained with earth and blood. The body had been there for some time, perhaps weeks, long enough for the jungle to begin reclaiming it. Animals had found it, and what remained was barely recognizable as human. But it was not the body itself that had disturbed Nguyen. It was what had been done to it. The soldier had not been killed in combat. He had been executed, shot at close range, his hands bound behind his back with wire that had cut deep into his wrists, and beside the body, placed with careful deliberation, was an American dog tag and a note written in Vietnamese. Nguyen translated the note in a voice that trembled despite his efforts to control it. The message was simple. This soldier had come looking for what was not his to find. Others had come before him, and others would come after, and they would all meet the same end. The jungle belonged to those who understood it, who respected it, who had made it their home. Outsiders were not welcome. Brennan stared at the note for a long moment, then looked at the ridge rising above them. Somewhere beyond that ridge was the depot they had been sent to destroy, and somewhere beyond that ridge was an enemy who had killed this soldier and left him here as a warning, an enemy who knew they were coming and was waiting for them with patience that had no limit. He made his decision. They would continue. They had not come this far to turn back, had not endured what they had endured to abandon their mission at the final obstacle. The dead soldier deserved better than that. The living soldiers deserved the chance to complete what they had started. They climbed the ridge in single file, the difficulty of the terrain making their usual formation impossible. The vegetation grabbed at their uniforms, their equipment, their weapons, as if the jungle itself was trying to hold them back. The slope was steeper than it had appeared from below, and progress was measured in meters per hour rather than kilometers. By late afternoon, they had reached the crest. Before them, the terrain fell away into a valley that looked different from anything they had encountered before. Instead of the uniform green of the jungle, this valley was pockmarked with clearings, some natural, others clearly man-made. Paths threaded between the clearings, worn into the earth by countless feet over years of use. And there, at the center of the valley, was a structure that could only be the depot they had been searching for. It was larger than intelligence had suggested, a complex of buildings and tunnels that spread across the valley floor like a small city. Brennan counted at least a dozen structures visible from his position, and he knew that what he could see was only a fraction of what existed below the surface. The depot was not just a supply point, it was a hub, a center of operations that supported enemy activities across the entire region. He reached for the radio, ready to call in the coordinates that would bring the full force of American air power down on this target. But before he could key the handset, Webb grabbed his arm, his face pale, his eyes fixed on something in the valley below. Movement. Hundreds of figures emerging from the buildings and tunnels, spreading out across the valley floor in formations that were unmistakably military. They moved with discipline and purpose, taking up positions that covered every approach to the complex. And as Brennan watched, he realized with cold certainty what was happening. They had not found the depot. The depot had found them, and the enemy was not defending their position. They were preparing to attack. The first shots came before Brennan could react. Bullets snapped through the air around them, striking trees and sending splinters flying. The soldiers dove for cover, their training taking over as their conscious minds struggled to process what was happening. One moment they had been observers, hidden on the ridgeline, studying their objective. The next, they were targets. Brennan shouted orders that were barely audible over the roar of gunfire. The platoon spread out along the ridge, finding whatever cover the terrain offered, returning fire at an enemy they could barely see. The muzzle flashes from below indicated positions, but the enemy soldiers themselves were invisible, hidden in the vegetation and the structures that dotted the valley floor. The firefight lasted perhaps 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. The Americans' superior firepower kept the enemy at distance, their M16s and M60 machine guns laying down a volume of fire that made any advance impossible, but the enemy did not need to advance. They had the numbers and the position, and they could afford to wait while the Americans exhausted their ammunition. When the firing finally stopped, an eerie silence fell over the valley. Brennan took stock of his situation. 2 men were wounded, neither critically, but their injuries would slow the platoon's movement. Ammunition was lower than he liked, with most soldiers down to half their original load, and the enemy, dozens or perhaps hundreds strong, held the high ground on all sides except the ridge they had just climbed. They were surrounded. The realization settled over Brennan like a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, making it hard to breathe. The perfect plan had led them into a trap so complete that escape seemed impossible. The depot they had been sent to destroy was a baited hook, and they had swallowed it whole. He called Webb over and had him establish contact with base. The situation report was brief and brutal. Enemy contact, overwhelming force, casualties, ammunition critical. They needed extraction immediately, or they would not survive the night. The response came after a delay that felt like eternity. Extraction was being arranged, but helicopters could not reach their position until morning. They would have to hold through the night. Hold through the night. The words sounded simple enough, but Brennan knew what they meant. They meant 12 hours of darkness, surrounded by an enemy who knew exactly where they were, with limited ammunition and wounded soldiers who needed medical attention they could not provide. They meant making every bullet count, staying awake and alert despite exhaustion, fighting off attacks that could come from any direction at any time. He gathered his squad leaders and laid out the situation without sugarcoating it. They were in trouble, serious trouble, but they were not dead yet. They had training and discipline and weapons that the enemy could not match. They had each other, and they had the ridge, which was defensible if they were smart about how they used it. The soldiers set to work transforming their position into a fortress. They dug fighting positions into the slope, arranged fields of fire to cover every approach, set up the wounded in the most protected area they could find. They pooled their ammunition and distributed it according to need, making sure the machine guns had enough to break up any massed assault. They set trip flares at the perimeter and positioned their remaining claymore mines at the most likely avenues of approach. By nightfall, they were as ready as they could be. Brennan walked the perimeter one last time, checking each position, exchanging words with each soldier. The fear in their eyes had been replaced by something harder, more determined. They knew what they faced, and they had accepted it. They would fight, and some of them would die, but they would not give up. The first attack came 2 hours after dark. The enemy emerged from the jungle without warning, waves of figures that seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves. They came in silence, their approach covered by the jungle's eternal chorus, and they were almost at the perimeter before the trip flares revealed them. The defenders opened fire, their weapons creating a wall of light and sound that tore through the attacking force. The machine guns were devastating, their tracers cutting glowing lines through the darkness, each line marking the death of an enemy soldier. The riflemen fired with precision born of desperation, making every round count, knowing that what they expended tonight could not be replaced. The attack lasted perhaps 20 minutes before the enemy withdrew, leaving behind bodies that littered the slope below the American positions. The soldiers did not cheer or celebrate. They simply reloaded their weapons, checked their fields of fire, and waited for the next assault. It came an hour later, from a different direction, with the same ferocity and the same result. The Americans held their position, their fire disciplined and effective, their casualties minimal. 2 more soldiers were wounded, one seriously, but the perimeter remained intact. The third attack came just before midnight, and this time the enemy brought mortars. The rounds crashed down on the American positions with devastating effect, blasting apart the fighting holes that had taken so long to construct, killing 2 soldiers instantly and wounding several more. In the chaos of the bombardment, the enemy infantry advanced, closing the distance before the defenders could reorganize. What followed was close combat, brutal and personal, fought with rifles and bayonets and bare hands in the darkness. Brennan found himself face to face with an enemy soldier, a young man whose features were barely visible in the muzzle flashes, and for a moment they stared at each other across the barrel of a rifle before Brennan pulled the trigger. The fighting lasted until dawn, wave after wave of attacks that gradually whittled down the American force. By morning, half the platoon was dead or wounded. Ammunition was virtually exhausted. The perimeter had contracted to a small circle around the wounded, barely large enough to hold the survivors. But they had held. Against all odds, against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1, they had held their position through the night. And as the sun rose over the ridge, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Brennan heard a sound that was more, but they had held. Against all odds, against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1, they had held their position through the night. And as the sun rose over the ridge, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Brennan heard a sound that was more beautiful than any music he had ever known. Helicopters. The distant thrum of rotors cutting through the morning air, growing louder with each passing second. He looked up and saw them emerging from the mist that clung to the valley, a flight of Hueys escorted by Cobra gunships, their shapes dark against the brightening sky. The enemy heard them too. The firing that had been constant through the night began to slacken as the Viet Cong realized what was coming. They knew they could not stand against the firepower those helicopters represented, the rockets and miniguns that would tear through their positions like a scythe through wheat. Webb was already on the radio, guiding the lead helicopter toward their position, his voice hoarse but steady. The Cobras swept low over the ridgeline, their miniguns roaring, laying down suppressive fire that drove the enemy back into the jungle. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, and to the survivors huddled on that ridge, it was the sound of salvation. The first Huey touched down in a small clearing just below their position, its rotors kicking up a storm of debris that stung their eyes and skin. Brennan organized the evacuation with what remained of his command structure, the wounded going first, then the able-bodied soldiers who helped carry them. The process was chaotic, desperate, conducted under fire that still came sporadically from the tree line despite the gunship's best efforts. Brennan was the last to leave. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his weapon empty, his uniform torn and stained with blood that was both his and others, watching as the final helicopter settled onto the ground. The crew chief was shouting at him, waving him aboard, but for a moment he could not move. He was looking at the ridge where they had fought, at the bodies of his men who would not be going home, at the jungle that had tried so hard to kill them all. Then hands were grabbing him, pulling him into the helicopter, and the ground was falling away beneath him. He watched the ridge grow smaller, watched the jungle close over it like water over a sinking stone, and felt something inside him break in a way that would never fully heal. The hospital at Da Nang was a world apart from the jungle, a place of white sheets and antiseptic smells, and the constant murmur of voices speaking in tones that were meant to comfort. Brennan lay in a bed by the window, his wounds bandaged, his body pumped full of antibiotics and painkillers that dulled the edges of everything, including memory. He had been there for 3 days when the colonel came to see him. The man was older than Brennan had expected, his face lined with the weight of decisions that had sent young men to die in places they could not pronounce. He pulled a chair beside Brennan's bed and sat down without speaking, his eyes fixed on something beyond the window that only he could see. The conversation that followed was quiet, almost gentle. The colonel explained what had happened, filling in the gaps that Brennan's fragmented memories could not bridge. The intelligence about the depot had been accurate, but incomplete. What they had not known, what no one could have known, was that the enemy had been expecting them for weeks. A captured document, an intercepted radio transmission, something had alerted them to the planned operation, and they had prepared accordingly. The depot had been a trap from the beginning, bait in a larger operation designed to draw American forces into a killing ground. Other units had been hit in similar ambushes across the region, part of a coordinated offensive that had caught command completely off guard. The losses had been significant, not just in lives but in confidence, in the belief that technology and training could overcome an enemy who knew the jungle as intimately as his own heartbeat. Brennan listened without speaking. He thought about Rodriguez and Webb and Peters and all the others who had followed him into that green hell, trusting him to lead them safely through. He thought about the body they had found on the ridge, the warning that had been left for them, the message they had ignored because the mission demanded it. The colonel seemed to sense what he was thinking. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The mission had not been a failure, he said. The intelligence gathered, the enemy forces identified, the understanding gained of their tactics and capabilities, all of it had value that could not be measured in the simple terms of objectives achieved or lives lost. War was not arithmetic. It was something far more complex, more terrible, more human. Brennan wanted to argue, wanted to shout that no intelligence was worth the lives of his men, that no understanding could justify what they had endured. But the words would not come. He was too tired, too empty, too aware that the colonel was simply doing what command always did, finding meaning in tragedy because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The colonel left him with a promise that his men would be recognized for their courage, that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. Brennan nodded and said nothing, knowing that medals and citations meant little to the dead, and even less to the living who would carry the memory of that ridge for the rest of their lives. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of recovery and reflection. Brennan's wounds healed slowly, the physical damage responding to treatment, even as the psychological wounds remained raw and open. He received visitors, other soldiers who had survived other battles, chaplains who offered prayers he could not accept, doctors who spoke of trauma in clinical terms that failed to capture its reality. He thought often about the jungle, about the enemy who had fought with such patience and determination, about the war that seemed to have no end and no purpose beyond the perpetuation of its own violence. He had come to Vietnam believing in the mission, believing that what they were doing mattered, that the sacrifices they made served some greater good. That belief had died on the ridge, killed by the same bullets that had taken so many of his men. 2 weeks after his evacuation, Brennan was declared fit for duty. He could have requested a transfer, could have found a way to spend his remaining months in Vietnam behind a desk somewhere safe. Instead, he asked to return to his unit, to the soldiers who had survived the ridge and the replacements who had arrived to fill the gaps left by the dead. The commander who approved his request looked at him with something like pity, or perhaps recognition. He had seen this before. Soldiers who returned to combat not because they wanted to fight, but because they could not abandon the men who still did. It was a form of loyalty that transcended reason, a bond forged in blood that nothing could break. Brennan returned to the field 3 weeks after the ridge. The jungle looked the same, endless and green and patient, waiting for them with the same indifference it had always shown. But something had changed in how Brennan saw it, how he understood his place within it. He no longer believed in perfect plans or certain outcomes. He believed only in the men beside him, in their courage and their fear, in their determination to survive another day in a war that seemed determined to consume them all. The war continued for years after the ridge, grinding forward through cycles of escalation and withdrawal, victory and defeat, hope and despair. Brennan served 2 more tours before finally rotating home, his body scarred, his mind forever marked by what he had seen and done. He returned to Ohio, to the small town where his father still worked the same steel mill, to a life that seemed impossibly distant from the jungles he had known. The adjustment was harder than the war itself. The skills that had kept him alive in combat were useless in civilian life, and the memories that haunted his nights had no place in a world that wanted to forget Vietnam had ever happened. He found work, married a woman who understood his silences, raised children who would never know the weight of what their father carried. But the ridge never left him. It came back in dreams, in the sudden crack of a car backfiring, in the green of summer forests that reminded him too much of another green, far away and long ago. He learned to live with it, to carry it as one carries any burden that cannot be set down, accepting its weight as the price of survival. Years later, decades after the last American helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof in Saigon, Brennan received a letter. It was from the son of Thomas Webb, the radio operator who had kept them connected to the world during those terrible days on the ridge. Webb had survived the war, had returned home, had lived a full life before passing away peacefully in his sleep. Before he died, he had asked his son to find Brennan, to deliver a message he had carried for 50 years. The message was simple. Webb had never forgotten the ridge, had never stopped being grateful for the decisions Brennan had made that night, the leadership that had kept them alive when everything seemed lost. He wanted Brennan to know that whatever guilt he carried, whatever doubts plagued him about what he could have done differently, the men who survived owed their lives to him. That debt could never be repaid, but it could be acknowledged, and Webb wanted to acknowledge it before he died. Brennan read the letter sitting on his porch, looking out at the Ohio countryside that bore no resemblance to the jungles of his youth. The words blurred as tears he had not shed in decades finally fell, grief and gratitude mingling in a release that felt like both ending and beginning. He thought about the young sergeant who had led his men into that green maze, confident in a plan that had been perfect on paper and worthless in the field. He thought about the lessons learned in blood and terror, about the enemy who had taught them that patience and knowledge of terrain could overcome any advantage of technology or firepower. He thought about the men who had not come home, whose names were now carved in black granite in a city far from the jungles where they died. The plan had been perfect. That was what they had believed, what they had been told, what they had staked their lives on. But perfection was an illusion, a comfort invented by those who had never felt the jungle close around them like a living thing. The jungle did not care about plans. It did not care about objectives or timelines or the careful calculations of men in air-conditioned rooms. It simply existed, patient and eternal, waiting for those who dared to enter it to learn its lessons in the hardest way possible. Brennan folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where he kept his medals, the citations that praised his courage, the photographs of men who had been young when the world was different. He closed the box and returned it to its shelf, then walked back to his porch and sat in the chair where he had read so many letters over the years. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that reminded him of mornings in the jungle, of dawns that meant survival for another day. He closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the Ohio evening, the birds and the breeze, and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, sounds that had once seemed impossibly remote, and now formed the soundtrack of his daily life. He had survived the ridge. He had come home. He had lived a life that the young sergeant on that helicopter could never have imagined. And if the memories still came, if the jungle still called to him in his dreams, that was simply part of the price. Some debts could never be fully paid. Some lessons could never be fully learned. Some silences could never be fully broken. The jungle had taught him that, and he had never forgotten. In the decades since the war ended, the jungle has reclaimed the ridge where Brennan and his men made their stand. The fighting positions have collapsed, filled with decades of fallen leaves and monsoon rains. The shell casings have rusted into the earth, becoming part of the soil that nourishes new growth. The paths the soldiers walked are gone, overgrown by vegetation that recognizes no boundaries between victor and vanquished. But the story remains. It lives in the memories of those who survived, in the letters they wrote and the testimonies they gave, in the records that document what happened on that ridge in March of 1968. It lives in the lessons learned by armies around the world, lessons about the limits of technology, about the importance of understanding terrain, about the courage of soldiers who fight not for abstract causes, but for the men beside them. The soldiers who died on that ridge are remembered now in ways they could never have imagined. Their names are inscribed on memorials, their stories told in books and documentaries, their sacrifice honored by generations who never knew them but understand what they gave. They were young men, most of them, barely old enough to vote, sent to fight a war they did not fully understand in a place they had never heard of before they received their orders. They went because their country asked them to. They fought because their brothers depended on them. They died because war demands payment in blood, and someone must always pay. Their plan had been perfect, drawn up by experts, approved by commanders, executed with precision. But the jungle had its own plans, patient and implacable, written in vines and shadows and the silence between gunshots. Michael Brennan lived to be 87 years old. He died peacefully, surrounded by family, his hand held by grandchildren who had heard his stories and honored his memory. His last words were a name, Rodriguez, spoken so softly that only those closest to him could hear. Then he closed his eyes and was still, finally at peace with the jungle that had shaped him, the war that had defined him, and the men who had followed him into the green silence and trusted him to bring them home. Some of them made it, some of them did not, but all of them are remembered now, not as statistics in a history book, but as human beings who faced the impossible and refused to surrender. Their plan seemed perfect. The jungle had other ideas, and in the space between intention and reality, between the map and the terrain, they found something that no plan could capture and no failure could diminish. They found each other. They found courage. They found the truth that war reveals to all who fight it, that in the end, we are only as strong as the bonds we form, the trust we build, the love we carry into the darkness when all other lights have failed. That is what the jungle taught them. That is what the ridge remembers. That is what remains when all the plans have failed, and all the battles have ended, and all that is left is the silence of green leaves reaching toward a sky that has seen everything and judges nothing. If you watched this far, it is because this story touched something deep inside you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. If this story moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories of courage and sacrifice deserve to be remembered, and your share helps keep their memory alive. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring stories like this one, untold accounts of courage, survival, and the human spirit facing impossible odds. You do not want to miss what comes next. Until the next story, until the next silence, until the next truth that history has been waiting to reveal.